The Novak residence presented itself in a manner that could have been mistaken for ordinary. Situated on the north side of a quiet suburban street, the house occupied a modest plot, flanked by properties of similar size and construction. Its exterior exhibited the faint patina of mid-20th century American suburban architecture, clapboard siding painted in muted cream, window shutters aligned symmetrically, and a small front lawn carefully maintained. No signage, no peculiar adornments, no visible indicators of activity beyond the expected domestic rhythm. Clara Evans arrived at the property at 8:45 hours. The weather was overcast, the diffuse light washing the neighborhood in a uniform gray. She noted the absence of vehicles in the driveway and on the street, aside from single sedan parked 2 houses down. The lack of movement suggested either an early hour or a household temporarily unoccupied. She approached the front entrance along the concrete path, noting the faint sound of a lawn sprinkler running in the distance. The front door itself was constructed of solid wood with a brass handle. There was no doorbell. Entry was facilitated by a key provided in advance. The lock mechanism was standard, with no additional electronic or mechanical security devices apparent. Upon insertion and rotation of the key, the door opened smoothly. The initial impression was one of neutrality. There were no visible cameras, sensors, or security warnings. The interior was dimly lit, the source of light primarily natural from adjacent windows, partially filtered through thin lace curtains. The entryway floor consisted of polished hardwood, worn along the central pathway. Footsteps produced a muted echo, suggesting the presence of subfloor cavity and the absence of carpeting beyond the immediate threshold. The walls were painted in off-white tones, punctuated by modest family photographs in simple frames. There were no indications of surveillance equipment. However, the precise alignment of the frames and the absence of personal clutter suggested a deliberate minimalism. A vestibule table held a single lamp, unlit at the time, and a small stack of newspapers folded with uniformity. There was an immediate, almost imperceptible asymmetry in the organization of the space. The lamp cord was slightly angled, the stack of newspapers not perfectly centered. Such details, while minor, suggested a controlled environment maintained with deliberate care. Clara made a mental note of these features, though she did not yet assign significance. The household schedule became apparent over the initial 10 minutes. The primary living area lay immediately beyond the entryway. It was sparsely furnished with a combination of functionally arranged seating and a small table. Items were positioned with precision. A single ashtray centered on the table, a radio placed equidistant from the seating arrangements. On closer inspection, the radio was of mid-1950s design, with frequency dials calibrated accurately, the antenna fully extended, its presence suggesting regular use. The kitchen adjoined the living area, accessible through a narrow doorway. Cabinetry was consistent with the era, clean, polished, and devoid of extraneous items. Countertops were clear, with the exception of a single cutting board and a small bowl of fruit. Appliances included a gas stove, refrigerator, and coffee maker, all in functional condition. No personal notes, calendars, or letters were immediately visible, a deviation from typical domestic arrangements observed in similar households. Clara's initial observation period included a survey of light, sound, and temperature. The interior lighting was dependent on natural daylight. No overhead fixtures were active. Ambient sound consisted primarily of external traffic at a low volume and the distant operation of mechanical devices in adjacent properties. The temperature was moderate, consistent with exterior conditions, suggesting the HVAC system was either inactive or operating minimally. Movement within the household followed a predictable pattern. Clara observed the entry and exit points of the primary occupants, noting timing and frequency. The principal figures, identified later as Mr. and Mrs. Novak, were not present upon her arrival. Clara utilized this interval to map spatial organization. The living room, kitchen, study, and a rear stairwell leading to upper-level bedrooms. Each room was sparsely furnished, with surfaces largely free of personal detritus. Attention was drawn to the study, located at the rear of the first floor. A single sign on the door read "Private," printed in modest block letters. Access appeared limited, with the door remaining closed during initial observation. Clara noted this restriction, though at the time she recorded it as standard household privacy rather than an unusual protocol. The staircase leading to the second floor exhibited were patterns consistent with routine use, suggesting the upper-level rooms were occupied with regularity. Hallway lighting consisted of small wall-mounted sconces, unlit during daylight. Doors were closed, consistent with general residential practice. Clara traced the layout mentally, establishing a baseline for future observation. In terms of sensory data, several minor cues were collected. The air held a faint odor of cleaning agents and polished wood. No discernible odors associated with food preparation were immediately present, implying either limited cooking activity or prior meal completion. Acoustic cues indicated that floors were relatively well insulated. Movement on upper levels produced muted sound. Windows, though closed, allowed visual inspection of the exterior, providing unobstructed sight lines to the street and adjacent properties. During her initial half-hour, Clara documented several procedural details: timing of ambient activity, positioning of household objects, and the operational state of appliances. She noted that the radio was never activated, yet appeared regularly tuned. The stack of newspapers remained undisturbed throughout her observation period. Photographs on the walls were noted for their absence of recent additions, suggesting either a stable household environment or a deliberate avoidance of frequent change. The first irregularity became apparent in the scheduling of room access. Observing a sequence of entry points, Clara noticed that the study door remained closed at all times except for brief intervals in the early morning and late evening. During these intervals, no movement was detectable through the partially visible gap under the door. The rule regarding restricted access to the study, while minor, established a pattern inconsistent with the otherwise ordinary household routines. Subtle indicators of control and surveillance were further identified. Furniture placement minimized blind spots, offering clear lines of sight throughout the living area. Surfaces were free of personal effects that might indicate external connections. Electrical outlets showed no signs of tampering. However, their consistent positioning and absence of additional cabling suggested deliberate oversight. Clara noted behavioral regularities as they occurred. The mail was retrieved at consistent hours, mechanical devices operated on predictable schedules, and entry points were monitored through the absence or presence of shadows at windows. While these observations remained within the bounds of normality, the cumulative effect suggested a heightened attention to procedural detail not characteristic of an average household. The first section of observation concluded with a complete survey of visible interiors. Clara compiled her notes, cataloging spatial layouts, temporal sequences of activity, and procedural anomalies. She documented the study access restriction, the unchanging arrangement of objects, and the presence of a fully functional yet unused radio. No overtly suspicious behavior had yet been recorded. However, the combination of precise object placement, restricted access rules, and subtle environmental control established a baseline from which further deviations could be identified. Clara's initial data collection served as the foundation for subsequent observation, establishing the procedural framework necessary to detect and analyze any emergent irregularities. This initial session concluded at 9:15 hours. Clara departed the residence, noting that no occupants had been present during her survey. She retained all observations in her notebook, systematically cataloging environmental, procedural, and temporal data. The first rule, restricted access to the study, remained the sole procedural anomaly observed, unaccompanied by context or justification. Clara Evans arrived at the Novak residence at 8:30 hours, maintaining the procedural methodology established during her initial survey. The weather remained overcast, producing soft, diffuse light that flattened surface contrasts across the suburban landscape. Traffic was sparse, and ambient noises were limited to distant mechanical sounds from adjacent properties and intermittent bird calls. Clara approached along the concrete path leading to the front door, noting minor environmental irregularities. Uneven patches of lawn near the foundation suggested selective maintenance, while small debris near the sidewalk had not been removed despite overall tidiness. The vestibule inside appeared unchanged from previous observation. The polished hardwood floor bore the same patterns, and the narrow pathway to the living area remained clearly defined. The table and lamp arrangement maintained prior alignment, although subtle deviations were recorded. The lamp cord extended marginally toward the baseboard, and the folded newspaper stack had rotated approximately 1 centimeter clockwise. Clara cataloged these minor discrepancies as part of a procedural baseline, emphasizing the need to identify even the smallest irregularities. The living area presented the same furniture arrangement: 2 armchairs flanking a low table, the ashtray placed centrally, and the radio positioned precisely equidistant from both chairs. Clara conducted a close visual examination of the radio, noting its dials, antenna, and minor dust accumulation patterns. The radio was inactive for the majority of the observation period, yet its physical conditions suggested occasional use. Clara recorded serial numbers and surface, where comparing them with prior observations to track potential handling frequency. The kitchen area was examined next. Countertops were largely clear except for a cutting board and a bowl of fruit, both of which displayed minor positional adjustments from previous visits. The coffee maker exhibited condensation indicative of recent use, although no direct interaction was observed. Cabinet interiors revealed orderly dish and utensil placement consistent with prior documentation. No letters, notes, or other written material were visible, reinforcing the impression of a controlled domestic environment. Clara also noted the faint odor of cleaning agents, combined with a subtle woody scent from polished surfaces, contributing to the sensory baseline of the space. Acoustic observation was conducted continuously. Footsteps produced minimal sound on hardwood surfaces, except for faint creaking on the rear staircase. Distant ambient noises, including traffic hum, mechanical operations, and bird calls, were recorded with exact timestamps. No unusual auditory signals such as telephone ringing, electronic interference, or vocalizations were detected. Clara maintained a log of decibel readings and relative sound variations across intervals to establish a procedural baseline. The study at the rear of the first floor remained restricted, the private sign unaltered. A thin gap beneath the door revealed intermittent shadows corresponding to activity within. Clara timed each interval, noting duration and movement patterns. The shadows were subtle, lacking identifiable form, yet consistent enough to suggest occupancy during restricted periods. These movements did not correlate with observable presence elsewhere in the house, establishing a controlled access pattern requiring longitudinal tracking. The radio emitted a brief, 7-second static signal at 9:12 hours without observable interaction. Clara documented frequency, duration, and environmental conditions, emphasizing the procedural anomaly. Minor object displacements were noted. The ashtray had shifted 2 centimeters laterally, while the bowl of fruit displayed rotational reorientation of individual pieces. Clara photographed all deviations and time-stamped them for future analysis. Lighting conditions were carefully monitored. Despite variations in external luminance caused by passing cloud cover, interior light levels remained largely constant. Wall sconces remained unlit, and daylight filtered through lace curtains provided diffuse, uniform illumination. Clara measured light levels with a photometer at multiple points within the living area, recording variations within a narrow 5% margin. She noted possible adjustment of blinds or subtle manipulation of window treatments to maintain uniform lighting. Patterns of movement within the household displayed additional irregularities. The front door was observed in use at 10:12 and 10:34 hours, without audible sound of key insertion, suggesting a mechanism designed to minimize noise or deliberate environmental control. The rear stairwell exhibited brief creaking at 10:18 hours, indicating foot traffic. No visual confirmation of the individual responsible was possible, and the timing did not correspond with other observed household activity. Clara cataloged these sequences with precise timestamps. Peripheral observation revealed an individual previously unrecognized in the vicinity of the front lawn at 9:50 hours. The person remained stationary for 3 minutes, departing without direct interaction with the household. Clara logged the position, duration, and movement direction, noting potential correlation with internal activity or surveillance procedures. Mail handling exhibited further irregularities. An envelope, devoid of identifiable postal markings, arrived at 10:05 hours. It was retrieved by a household member within 10 minutes. The speed and method of retrieval suggested deliberate handling. Clara photographed the envelope, measured dimensions, and recorded timing and behavior details. No content could be discerned, though procedural handling was meticulously noted. Environmental control extended to minor objects. The bowl of fruit, ashtray, and vestibule newspaper stack all displayed small but consistent positional shifts compared with prior sessions. Clara recorded these movements with photographs and millimeter-level measurements. Furniture placement minimized blind spots and ensured clear sight lines throughout the living area, suggesting intentional spatial control. Electrical outlets and cabling remained undisturbed, consistent with prior observations. Behavioral patterns across multiple observation intervals were systematically documented. Mail retrieval, kitchen appliance use, object handling, and movement through entry points followed predictable timing sequences, with minor deviations precisely logged. Each event received a numerical identifier, cross-referenced with previous sessions to identify emergent patterns. Minor acoustic cues, floor creaks, distant mechanical sounds, and ambient traffic were cataloged alongside visual data. Additional environmental observations were recorded. The air temperature within the house remained stable, showing minor variation within 1 degree Celsius, indicating either careful HVAC management or passive thermal stability. Relative humidity was noted through condensation on the coffee maker and ambient moisture levels, suggesting controlled environmental conditions. Clara included sensory data, such as faint cleaning agent odors, subtle wooden polish scent, and filtered daylight qualities, to build a comprehensive procedural record. Subtle anomalies continued to accumulate. The ashtray and fruit bowl adjustments, minor newspaper rotations, and restricted study access collectively suggested a high level of environmental precision. Clara's meticulous documentation aimed to isolate deviations from normative domestic routines without assigning interpretive meaning. By mid-morning, all observed anomalies were systematically logged, photographed, and time-stamped. Patterns emerged across multiple domains: spatial organization, object handling, restricted access, intermittent electronic signals, lighting uniformity, and peripheral surveillance. Individually, these anomalies could plausibly be mundane. Collectively, however, they suggested deliberate procedural orchestration. Clara recorded each event factually, emphasizing baseline establishment and anomaly cataloging without conjecture. Observations extended to repeated measurement of lighting angles, shadow lengths, and surface reflections across intervals. Minor shifts were recorded, noting the stability of illumination despite external cloud movement. Acoustic measurements were logged with timestamps for cross-referencing with foot traffic, appliance use, and peripheral activity. Peripheral individuals' appearances were documented for duration, movement direction, and potential correlation with household patterns. Towards the end of the session, Clara performed a final sweep of interior surfaces, documenting subtle deviations in object placement, alignment, and environmental cues. The study remained inaccessible, with intermittent shadow movement continuing to follow established timing intervals. The radio remained largely inactive, except for the brief static signal previously observed. Minor creaks in the rear staircase persisted without predictable association with other activity. The observation period concluded at 11:45 hours, with Clara exiting the residence via the same procedural path. Notes, photographs, acoustic measurements, and environmental readings were carefully organized for longitudinal comparison. The cumulative dataset encompassed precise measurements of environmental, procedural, and temporal anomalies, all recorded within a strictly observational framework. Patterns identified during this session provided a detailed procedural baseline for further investigative activity. The investigation phase began 3 days after the last observation session. Clara Evans arrived at the Novak residence at 8:30 hours, maintaining the same procedural approach as prior sessions. The external environment remained quiet, traffic was minimal, and ambient suburban noises were restricted to distant mechanical sounds and occasional birdsong. Cloud cover persisted, producing diffuse daylight that minimized shadows and flattened surface contrasts. Clara approached the front door with deliberate attention, observing the pathway, lawn, and foundation for any environmental changes. Minor debris near the walkway was noted, unchanged from previous sessions, indicating selective maintenance or consistent procedural control. Entry into the vestibule was uneventful, with floor patterns and table arrangements consistent with prior observations. The lamp cord, previously slightly extended toward the baseboard, was unchanged, while the newspaper stack had rotated marginally clockwise. Clara recorded these details as part of an updated procedural baseline. The hardwood flooring produced faint echoes underfoot, consistent with prior acoustic observations. Upon entering the living area, Clara conducted a systematic survey of object placement and environmental conditions. The armchairs remained aligned symmetrically on either side of a low table. The ashtray rested centrally, and the radio, positioned equidistantly from both chairs, remained inactive. Clara approached the radio for detailed examination, measuring dials, inspecting the antenna, and noting minor dust accumulation patterns. The device appeared functional but was used only sporadically, suggesting controlled activation aligned with undisclosed patterns. The kitchen was examined with heightened scrutiny. Countertops remained largely clear, with the cutting board and bowl of fruit displaying subtle positional adjustments consistent with prior sessions. The coffee maker contained residual condensation, indicative of recent use, although no direct handling was observed. Cabinet interiors were orderly, with all utensils and dishware in precise alignment. No letters, written notes, or documents were visible on countertops, reinforcing the controlled nature of the household environment. Clara also recorded olfactory observations, faint traces of cleaning agents, residual aroma of polished wood, and an underlying scent of brewed coffee. Clara began targeted surveillance of the study at the rear of the first floor. The private sign on the door remained present, and the gap beneath allowed partial observation of shadow movement. She timed each interval meticulously, noting start and end times and correlated shadow movement with other household activity. The shadows persisted during periods when no other occupants were visibly present, reinforcing the hypothesis of controlled access and procedural orchestration. Attention shifted to potential hidden objects and subtle anomalies throughout accessible areas. Clara systematically inspected surfaces without touching them, using visual observation and photography to record deviations. The ashtray and fruit bowl displayed minor displacements from previously documented positions. Books on shelves were consistently aligned, though a slight rotational shift of approximately 2 mm was noted in one hardcover. Photographic evidence was captured, with timestamps, to maintain longitudinal records. Electrical outlets and cabling were examined for modifications or unusual patterns. No tampering was detected, yet the consistent placement of all electrical devices suggested deliberate control to maintain an organized visual and functional environment. Clara documented the precise configuration of outlets, switches, and appliance connections. Lighting and environmental conditions were measured continuously. Interior illumination remained stable, despite minor fluctuations in external light due to shifting cloud cover. Photometer readings indicated variation within a narrow margin of 3 to 5%. Blinds and lace curtains appeared adjusted to maintain uniform light levels. Clara also recorded temperature and relative humidity at multiple points, noting minimal variation, consistent with prior observations. Clara initiated a systematic review of minor procedural anomalies. The radio, previously inactive except for a brief static signal, emitted no further signals during the session. Minor object displacements continued. The ashtray and fruit bowl exhibited consistent small adjustments, the newspaper stack rotated slightly, and one pen on the vestibule table shifted its alignment. Each occurrence was photographed, time-stamped, and cataloged. Attention was given to potential communication indicators. Telephone lines in the house were observed but remained inactive. No external sounds indicative of phone calls, knocks, or messages were detected. Mail handling remained consistent with prior sessions. Unmarked envelopes were retrieved promptly and handled with procedural discretion. Clara documented each arrival and retrieval, noting deviations from typical domestic patterns. Clara extended her surveillance to the exterior environment. Peripheral individuals, previously observed at irregular intervals, appeared on the front lawn at 9:50 hours. The individual remained stationary for 3 minutes, departing without direct interaction. Clara logged position, duration, and movement direction, considering potential correlation with internal household activity. Repeated occurrences reinforced the possibility of external observation or monitoring consistent with espionage activity. A critical component of the investigation involved examination of temporal patterns. Clara cross-referenced household movement, object displacements, and peripheral observations. The study access intervals exhibited consistent timing, suggesting a schedule controlling the use of the room. Minor adjustments in furniture, objects, and environmental factors occurred at precise intervals. Clara employed spreadsheets and time-stamped photographic documentation to identify and catalog patterns. Clara also scrutinized potential signals from non-obvious sources. The radio, although inactive, remained under observation for intermittent signals. She scanned the room for light reflections, minor acoustic anomalies, or subtle vibrations in surfaces that could indicate hidden mechanisms. Slight undulations in the carpet near the rear stairwell were noted, potentially suggesting prior movement or concealed objects. No direct evidence of tampering or hidden devices was observable, yet the anomalies were recorded for longitudinal comparison. Object placement was analyzed with millimeter precision. The ashtray's lateral displacement was recorded in relation to fixed furniture, and rotational adjustments of fruit in the bowl were documented. Books, magazines, and personal items were examined for subtle positional changes, including orientation, stacking order, and angular rotation. Each variation was photographed with timestamp reference points to ensure accurate comparison with prior observation sessions. Clara expanded her focus to minor environmental details. Dust accumulation on windowsills, slight smudges on polished surfaces, and subtle scratches on hardwood floors were cataloged. These details were considered potential indicators of interaction, procedural deviations, or environmental manipulation. Lighting angles and shadow lengths were measured at multiple points, recording minor deviations from baseline conditions. Ambient sound was monitored for background consistency, confirming the absence of unobserved events or irregular acoustic patterns. Kitchen observations revealed additional minor anomalies. Countertop surfaces exhibited slight smudging near the fruit bowl and cutting board, potentially indicating prior handling. Residual moisture on the coffee maker was consistent with previous condensation, suggesting recent use. No direct human interaction was observed, yet these indicators were logged as potential procedural evidence. Peripheral observation continued to be integral. Clara documented a second individual on the front lawn at 10:15 hours, stationary for 4 minutes, then departing along the sidewalk. Detailed notes on position, posture, and movement direction were recorded. Although no interaction with household members occurred, these events were cross-referenced with internal activity, reinforcing potential external monitoring. By late morning, Clara had accumulated a substantial dataset of minor anomalies: object displacements, restricted access intervals, environmental stability measures, acoustic baseline readings, peripheral observation records, and potential communication signals. Each item was documented with photographic evidence, timestamps, and descriptive notation. Patterns were systematically identified across spatial, temporal, and environmental dimensions. The investigation also included monitoring of entry points. The front door was used at 10:12 hours and 10:34 hours without detectable key insertion sounds. The rear stairwell exhibited intermittent creaks consistent with brief foot traffic. No visual confirmation of the responsible individual was possible, and the observed timings did not correlate with other household activity. All data was logged with precision, maintaining a comprehensive record for longitudinal analysis. Environmental control measures were noted, including temperature stability, minimal light fluctuation, and uniform humidity. Subtle scent observations, cleaning agents, polished wood, and faint brewed coffee aroma were recorded to enrich the procedural dataset. Object arrangements, minor displacements, and rotational adjustments were cataloged, emphasizing consistency or deviation from established baselines. By 11:45 hours, the investigation session concluded with Clara departing via the front entry. The cumulative observations provided a high-resolution procedural dataset documenting all minor anomalies, environmental control factors, and temporal patterns. These records established a foundation for subsequent analytical work, allowing identification of patterns consistent with controlled household activity and potential espionage operations. Clara Evans returned to the Novak residence at 8:20 hours, advancing her investigation with heightened vigilance. Ambient suburban conditions were consistent with prior sessions. Overcast skies produced diffuse daylight, minimizing shadow contrasts. Traffic remained minimal. Distant mechanical noises were intermittent, and occasional birdsong punctuated the background. Clara approached the front door along the concrete pathway, noting environmental consistencies. Lawn maintenance patterns remained precise, and minor debris near the foundation had not been disturbed. These observations suggested continued procedural control of the external environment. Entry into the vestibule revealed a continuation of previous patterns. Hardwood flooring exhibited familiar were along the central pathway, and the table and lamp maintained prior alignment. The newspaper stack had rotated slightly clockwise compared with the previous session. Clara recorded these observations, emphasizing that even minimal deviations could indicate subtle internal activity. The vestibule floor produced muted echoes underfoot, consistent with prior acoustic monitoring. The living area was examined systematically. 2 armchairs flanked the low table, which remained clear except for the centrally placed ashtray. The radio remained inactive, its physical condition indicating functional status but controlled use. Clara documented surface dust patterns and dials on the radio, maintaining photographic records. Slight variations in dust accumulation suggested prior handling during intervals outside her observation, potentially indicating episodic household activity coordinated with internal schedules. The kitchen exhibited familiar environmental consistencies. Countertops were largely clear, aside from a cutting board and a bowl of fruit, both of which displayed minor positional adjustments. The coffee maker contained residual condensation consistent with prior observations. Cabinets remained organized, with utensils and dishware in precise alignment. Clara noted subtle olfactory cues, faint cleaning agent residues, residual wood polish, and lingering coffee aroma. These environmental indicators contributed to the baseline necessary for procedural analysis. Observation of the study door revealed restricted access persisted. The private sign remained in place, and shadow movement beneath the door occurred intermittently. Clara timed each shadow interval, recording precise duration and pattern. The shadow activity persisted during periods when no other household movement was observable, suggesting controlled internal access. Deviations from previous timing intervals were noted as potentially significant. During this session, Clara expanded her examination to include potential surveillance indicators within the living area. She observed minor changes in furniture alignment. The ashtray exhibited lateral displacement, the fruit bowl rotated slightly, and the newspaper stack had shifted. Books and other objects on shelves showed subtle rotational variations of approximately 1 to 2 millimeters. Each variation was photographed with timestamps, cataloged, and cross-referenced with prior sessions. These small movements indicated controlled internal activity, potentially linked to operational procedures. Electrical and lighting observations were critical. Outlets and cabling displayed no evidence of tampering, yet their consistent arrangement suggested deliberate management. Interior illumination remained constant, measured across multiple points with a photometer. Daylight filtering through lace curtains produced uniform levels, and blinds appeared adjusted to minimize shadow variation. Minor fluctuations were logged and included in procedural records, emphasizing environmental control. Movement within the household revealed subtle irregularities with potential operational significance. The front door was opened at 9:15 hours and again at 9:38 hours, producing no discernible sound from key insertion. The rear stairwell emitted intermittent creaks consistent with brief foot traffic. No visual confirmation of the individuals responsible was possible, yet timing patterns were cataloged to identify potential deviations from established baselines. Peripheral observation continued to yield anomalies. At 9:50 hours, an individual unfamiliar to prior sessions appeared on the front lawn, remaining stationary for approximately 4 minutes before departing. Position, posture, and direction of movement were documented. Cross-referencing these events with internal household activity suggested potential external monitoring. A second individual appeared at 10:22 hours, following a similar pattern. These repeated peripheral occurrences indicated coordinated surveillance aligned with internal operations. The investigation advanced to subtle environmental inconsistencies indicative of procedural orchestration. Dust patterns, surface smudges, and minor scratches on the hardwood floor were documented. The ashtray and fruit bowl continued to display controlled displacements, while books, magazines, and other personal items demonstrated rotational adjustments. Clara employed photographic documentation and detailed timestamp notes to ensure longitudinal tracking. These cumulative observations suggested purposeful manipulation consistent with operational protocols. Clara noted minor anomalies in household appliances. The coffee maker displayed residual moisture inconsistent with recent visible handling. The radio remained largely inactive except for brief, unobserved signal bursts consistent with prior patterns. Minor adjustments in electrical outlet usage, lighting positions, and furniture alignment were systematically documented, emphasizing strict procedural control. During the session, Clara observed small deviations in temporal patterns. The study door access intervals occurred earlier than in previous sessions by approximately 3 minutes, while peripheral observation events displayed minor timing variations. Object placement alterations occurred with greater frequency, including rotational shifts in books and alignment adjustments in small objects on tables. These temporal deviations suggested a potential increase in operational activity or responsiveness to external factors. Environmental sensory data was recorded continuously. Light angles, shadow lengths, and surface reflections were measured at multiple points throughout the living area. Minor fluctuations were cataloged and compared with prior readings. Acoustic measurements indicated no additional anomalies beyond expected floor creaks, distant traffic, and intermittent mechanical noises. Temperature and humidity remained stable, contributing to a controlled environmental baseline. Clara intensified her procedural documentation of minor anomalies. The ashtray and fruit bowl shifts were recorded, and subtle rotations of books, magazines, and small objects were noted. Photographs were taken with millimeter precision, including time-stamped reference grids for comparative analysis. The radio, while inactive, remained under observation for intermittent signals. Subtle patterns of object handling and environmental adjustment suggested deliberate internal activity with operational intent. Peripheral surveillance continued. An individual appeared on the front lawn at 10:45 hours, maintaining a stationary position for 4 minutes before departing along a predictable route. Observations of this nature were cross-referenced with internal household activity and object displacements. Multiple instances of peripheral observation indicated a potential network monitoring system designed to track internal and external interactions. Minor environmental cues were recorded systematically. Dust accumulation, surface smudges, subtle scratches, and minor floor deviations were cataloged. Light consistency, shadow orientation, and ambient sound levels were documented with precise measurement tools. Each anomaly was photographed and time-stamped, contributing to the longitudinal dataset. The investigation highlighted subtle procedural escalation within the household. Minor object displacements occurred with greater frequency, lighting adjustments were more precise, and peripheral surveillance was more consistent. Temporal deviations in restricted study access suggested a dynamic response to internal or external stimuli. Clara's observations were strictly factual, cataloged without conjecture, and emphasized longitudinal pattern recognition. Further analysis involved monitoring entry and exit points. The front door was accessed at 11:12 hours and 11:34 hours without detectable key insertion noise. The rear stairwell exhibited intermittent creaking consistent with brief foot traffic. Observations were recorded with exact timestamps, contributing to the procedural database. Minor anomalies in furniture alignment and object placement were cataloged concurrently. Environmental control measures were assessed throughout the session. Temperature, light levels, humidity, and air circulation were measured at multiple points. Olfactory cues, including cleaning agents, polished wood, and residual coffee aroma, were recorded to enrich procedural data. Minor displacements in household objects, rotations, and alignments were systematically cataloged with photographs and precise measurements. By late morning, Clara had accumulated a comprehensive procedural dataset highlighting controlled internal activity, peripheral surveillance, and environmental manipulation. The dataset included precise measurements, photographic evidence, time-stamped records, and detailed notation of minor anomalies. Patterns indicated heightened operational activity and potential escalation of procedural vigilance within the Novak household. The session concluded at 11:50 hours, with Clara exiting via the front pathway. All observations were systematically organized, cross-referenced, and cataloged for longitudinal comparison. The cumulative evidence indicated increased operational control, heightened surveillance, and potential risk factors associated with further investigative activity. Clara Evans arrived at the Novak residence at 8:25 hours, beginning the final stage of her systematic observation. Ambient conditions in the suburban environment remained consistent with prior sessions. Overcast skies produced diffuse, flat daylight, traffic was minimal, distant mechanical noises punctuated the background, birdsong occurred intermittently. Clara approached the front door along the concrete path, observing environmental consistencies. Lawn maintenance, debris placement, and foundation edges were unchanged, indicating continued procedural control over the external environment. Entry into the vestibule proceeded as in previous sessions. Hardwood flooring exhibited familiar where along the central pathway, and the table and lamp remained in prior alignment. The newspaper stack had rotated minimally, approximately 1 centimeter clockwise. Clara cataloged these details as part of an updated baseline. Floor acoustics produced muted echoes, consistent with prior observations. Each environmental and spatial detail was photographed, time-stamped, and recorded to allow cross-referencing with previous sessions. The living area presented the same furniture arrangement. 2 armchairs flanking a low table, the ashtray centrally positioned, and the radio placed equidistantly. The radio remained inactive, with dust accumulation patterns indicating sporadic handling. Clara photographed the radio, measured dials, and recorded physical characteristics to compare against prior observation. Minor displacements in the ashtray and the fruit bowl were recorded, continuing the longitudinal tracking of procedural deviations. The kitchen displayed familiar environmental consistencies. Countertops were largely clear except for a cutting board and bowl of fruit, both of which exhibited minor positional adjustments. The coffee maker contained residual condensation, consistent with prior observations, suggesting controlled recent use. Cabinets remained orderly, with utensils and dishware in precise alignment. Subtle olfactory cues, cleaning agents, polished wood, and coffee aroma were documented as part of a comprehensive sensory baseline. Clara focused on the study at the rear of the first floor. The private sign remained in place, and shadow movement beneath the door was observed intermittently. Each interval was timed precisely, and deviations from prior sessions were noted. The study continued to exhibit restricted access, yet shadow patterns indicated controlled internal activity. These movements were cross-referenced with object displacements in accessible areas to identify correlated procedural activity. Object placement and environmental anomalies were systematically documented. Minor rotations and displacements were observed: the ashtray and fruit bowl, the newspaper stack, and small books and objects on shelves. Photographs and time-stamped reference points were collected to allow detailed comparative analysis. These subtle deviations provided indicators of deliberate operational orchestration within the household. Electrical and lighting systems were monitored closely. Outlets and cabling displayed no evidence of tampering but remained consistently positioned, suggesting deliberate internal control. Interior illumination was measured at multiple points, with photometer readings confirming uniform levels. Blinds and curtains appeared adjusted to maintain consistent light conditions, minimizing natural variation. Temperature and humidity were recorded, remaining stable throughout the observation period. Clara observed movement patterns within the household with heightened precision. The front door was accessed at 9:10 hours and 9:32 hours without detectable key insertion noise. The rear stairwell emitted intermittent creaks consistent with brief foot traffic. Timing sequences were recorded with exact timestamps, emphasizing deviations from prior baselines. Object handling, including minor displacements and rotational adjustments, was logged and photographed for comparative analysis. Peripheral observation continued. An unfamiliar individual appeared on the front lawn at 9:45 hours, stationary for approximately 4 minutes before departing. Position, movement direction, and posture were recorded. A second individual appeared at 10:18 hours, following a similar stationary pattern before departing. These repeated peripheral observations were cross-referenced with internal household activity, suggesting coordinated monitoring consistent with espionage procedures. Clara expanded sensory observation to subtle environmental cues. Dust accumulation on window sills, smudges on polished surfaces, and minor floor scratches were cataloged. Light angles, shadow lengths, and reflection points were measured and recorded. Ambient sounds, including floor creaks, distant traffic, and intermittent mechanical noises, were logged with precise timestamps. Olfactory cues, including cleaning agents, polished wood, and faint coffee aroma, were documented systematically. The radio remained largely inactive, with no intermittent signals observed during the session. Minor object displacements continued. The ashtray, fruit bowl, and newspaper stack displayed controlled adjustments. Books and other small objects on shelves exhibited slight rotational shifts. Each deviation was photographed and time-stamped, allowing longitudinal comparison and pattern identification. Clara noted minor temporal anomalies in household activity. The study door access intervals occurred slightly earlier than in prior sessions by approximately 2 to 3 minutes. Peripheral observation events displayed consistent duration but slight timing variations. Minor object placement changes occurred with increased frequency. These procedural deviations suggested ongoing internal adjustments to operational routines, reinforcing the likelihood of deliberate orchestration. Environmental control measures were assessed continuously. Temperature, light levels, humidity, and airflow were measured at multiple points, remaining within narrow ranges. Minor fluctuations in light angles and shadow positions were recorded. Acoustic levels were monitored, confirming consistency with prior observations. Subtle scents, cleaning agents, polished wood, residual coffee aroma were noted to enrich procedural documentation. Clara conducted a final systematic sweep of accessible areas. Minor displacements of objects, rotational adjustments, and surface smudges were recorded. Photographs were taken with millimeter precision and time-stamped reference grids. This procedure ensured the accumulation of detailed longitudinal data, capturing subtle patterns of internal activity and environmental control. Peripheral observation remained a key component. At 10:45 hours, a third individual appeared on the front lawn, stationary for 4 minutes before departing. Detailed notes on posture, movement direction, and duration were recorded. Cross-referencing these events with internal activity reinforced the pattern of coordinated surveillance, indicative of operational awareness and controlled external monitoring. Clara further examined entry and exit points. The front door was accessed at 11:05 hours and 11:28 hours without detectable key insertion noise. The rear stairwell exhibited brief creaks at 11:15 hours, consistent with short, controlled movement. All movements were time-stamped, cataloged, and cross-referenced with object displacements and shadow activity to identify correlated procedural behavior. Environmental and procedural anomalies were recorded meticulously. Dust accumulation, surface smudges, and minor floor scratches were documented. Subtle shifts in object placement, rotations of small items, and adjustments of books were photographed with precise measurements. Interior lighting consistency, minor shadow variations, and acoustic baselines were logged, reinforcing procedural control observations. By late morning, Clara had compiled a comprehensive dataset encompassing internal movement, object displacements, shadow intervals, lighting measurements, acoustic readings, peripheral surveillance events, and subtle environmental cues. Each observation was time-stamped, photographed, and cataloged to allow for longitudinal analysis. Patterns indicated deliberate orchestration of household routines and coordinated external monitoring. The final synthesis of evidence revealed procedural escalation. Minor object adjustments occurred with increased frequency, peripheral surveillance events were more consistent, and shadow activity displayed slightly altered timing intervals. Environmental control, including lighting, temperature, humidity, and acoustic stability, remained highly precise. Clara's documentation emphasized factual recording and pattern recognition without conjecture. Clara concluded her final observation at 11:55 hours. She exited the residence via the front pathway, carefully recording departure time and any immediate environmental changes. The comprehensive dataset provided a high-resolution record of household activity, subtle operational behavior, and external monitoring patterns. Each observation had been meticulously documented to support longitudinal analysis and eventual operational assessment. Post-session analysis involved reviewing photographic evidence, time-stamped logs, environmental measurements, and procedural deviations. Patterns were identified across spatial, temporal, and sensory dimensions, revealing controlled internal activity, coordinated peripheral observation, and precise environmental manipulation. Minor anomalies, though individually plausible, collectively indicated deliberate orchestration consistent with espionage protocols. The procedural baseline established across all sessions allowed Clara to conclude that the Novak household operated under strict internal control, supplemented by external surveillance. Each minor deviation, object displacement, rotational adjustment, restricted access timing, shadow intervals, peripheral observation, and subtle environmental cue, contributed to the identification of operational patterns. The accumulation of these factors indicated a deliberate, highly controlled domestic environment consistent with covert espionage activity. Clara's final documentation included photographic records of object placement, rotational adjustments, shadow intervals, peripheral surveillance events, environmental measurements, temperature, light, humidity, acoustics, olfactory cues, and minor procedural deviations. Each data point was time-stamped, categorized, and cross-referenced with prior observations to ensure accurate longitudinal comparison. The final resolution of investigative observation established a procedural framework for understanding the Novak household's operational behavior. Clara's approach had emphasized continuous observation, meticulous record-keeping, and comprehensive sensory analysis. All anomalies, environmental controls, and peripheral events were recorded without interpretive bias, forming a factual dataset for analytical assessment. By systematically synthesizing all collected data, Clara identified consistent patterns indicative of deliberate orchestration of household routines, controlled environmental conditions, and coordinated external surveillance. Each element, individually plausible, formed a coherent operational narrative when considered collectively. The Novak residence displayed a level of procedural precision, internal control, and external monitoring consistent with espionage activity, providing the conclusive basis for Clara's investigative assessment.